So we're going to be kicking off. So we've had a couple of talks, but we really wanted to kick off the conference with a slightly different session. So I want you to think about this session as more of a conversation. We want to get a dialogue going, a little bit sort of like CNN, Hologarani, Kate Baldwin's my. So do get lively. By the way, my name is Caroline Sutton. I do work with Taylor and Francis currently. I was mentioned earlier. I earlier was a part of founding OWASPA, together with some others that I'll mention in a moment. Thank you. And I, at that time, had helped co-found a pure OA publishing company. And I've now come sort of full circle. I had left Taylor and Francis to start that publishing company, and I've now come back to Taylor and Francis. And that says a little bit as well about what's happened in the last 10 years. I've also given talks called Confessions of a Born-Again Subscription Publisher, if you want to look that up at the UKSG website. In any event, this panel, what we wanted to do here is we wanted to gather together some people who were there at the start of OWASPA, and I think in all cases here even before, who are still involved in this arena. And we wanted to look back a little bit in order to think about the trajectory that we are on and where we're heading to. What have we got right? What do we need to fix? How can we keep things moving in the right direction? We've also tried to pull together a panel that represents some varied interests, some varied perspectives. And I do want to say that obviously many other individuals could have also been invited to be on this panel, many of whom are sitting in the room today. So let me just first mention who is on the panel, though, and then I may mention some folks who have sent regrets and also some of the others that we very well could have had here. So I first want to introduce David Prosser. And I think most people on the panel don't actually need introduction, but I do want to say a few words nonetheless. I think as everyone knows, David is the Executive Director of the Research Libraries UK. And that is the representative body for the UK's leading research libraries. But before that, and this is where David's connection to OWASPA also comes in, David was very critical in helping us set up OWASPA because David was earlier the Executive Director for SPARC Europe. And SPARC Europe very much helped OWASPA get started. David was very useful as a sounding board while we were writing our bylaws. And not to mention SPARC Europe had provided some financial support while we were getting things started. We also are joined by Lars Bjørnshauge. And Lars, too, was very instrumental in kicking things off. Lars, as I'm sure everyone knows, is currently the Executive Director, or the Managing Director, I'm sorry, for the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. But before that, Lars was, among many things, the Director of Research Libraries at the University of Lund, where the Directory of Open Access Journals was first started, together with some folks that we have sitting in the audience today. And Lars was hosting, together with his colleagues in Lund, the Nordic Conference on Scholarly Communications. And that was the first conference that was becoming very OA-friendly, and where the few people who were involved in OA publishing started meeting up annually and talking with one another and discussing what was going on. And Lars finally came to us one day and said, shouldn't you guys have an organization? Shouldn't you as open access publishers have your own voice in this debate? And we thought, yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. And then he also said, well, I think it's time that you take over the conference too. So that was when we took over in 2009. I tweeted 2008 earlier this week. It was 2009. Obviously, this is the 10th. So that is Lars. We're also joined today by Susan Murray, who is the Executive Director of African Journals Online, AJOL. Susan has joined at least a couple of our conferences over the years, and has brought to us a really important perspective from Africa. And I know that you've been involved in more than 10 years now around open access, haven't you? Yes, so quite some time. And then Paul Peters, who is currently the CEO of Hindawi, where, Paul, you've been at Hindawi how many years now?
2004.
2004. And Hindawi transitioned all of their journals to OA in 2007, correct? Yes. Paul was one of the first open access publishers that I met because he was social and was going around trying to find us all, and also got kick-starting the organization. And I would also mention that Hindawi was very important in providing a lot of the support and some of the administration for us as we were getting OWASPA started, not least of which Claire Redhead, who is now our executive director, originally was working with Hindawi, and then we borrowed her in, and eventually she came to work for us. And Paul is, of course, the current president of OASPA. And then finally, on my left, Jean-Claude Guédon, who I think probably needs no introduction, who certainly has been there since the start and way before 10 years ago with the first BOAI, Budapest Open Access Initiative in 2002 and even earlier, and who continues to contribute to the dialogue, and who we really are happy to have joining us, because one of the things that we often miss at these conferences is hearing from researchers themselves. And I think you've got that contact in a way that we don't always have. So I'd like to thank all the panel for joining. I'm going to kick off with some questions. I just want one last point before I go on. I just want to make the point that I'm going to be playing a bit of devil's advocate, posing questions, asking questions, occasionally stating things. And I just want to say that I'm not stating that as an official Taylor and Francis statement. I'm saying this partly as myself, but partly as I'm in a role, and these are questions I want to ask. So I don't see anybody, oh, Taylor and Francis says X, Y, Z. Maybe we say that, but maybe we don't. So just to make that clear. And again, lots of folks could have joined us on this panel today. And I thought we could start off with an easy question. And I think I'll start down at the end with you, David. I wanted to ask each person to think about an individual or an organization that you think has been particularly influential in setting us on the trajectory that we have been on and where we're at today. And a couple, if you have a couple, that's okay.
It's very difficult because there have been so many, and as you pointed out, there's so many within this room. You very kindly gave us sight of the easy question beforehand, so we had a little chance to think about it. I mean, for me, if I was to choose one person, Melissa Hagman from OSF, so used to be the Open Society Institute, now the Open Society Foundation, and she has been there right from the beginning. The OSF, OSI as was the body that convened the Budapest Open Access Initiative, and you can see that as being the sort of triggering point of when the discussions that were rather nebulous around some of these issues really found focus. So she, without her and without her interest, I think that we may not have had that point. But then a lot of points since then. I mean, I think she helped to fund DOAJ. I think a lot of us in this room will have received funding through her from the time. And and she's a very modest person who sits maybe perhaps a little bit in the background, but the effect that she has had through her deep thinking about the issues and, frankly, her access to money has been, I think, hugely transformative for us.
Absolutely. And just to mention that Melissa was invited to take part on the panel and unfortunately couldn't join us today. So good choice, and it's nice that we could mention her. Lars, I know you also had lots of conversations with Melissa over the years. Are there other persons, organizations that you found to be particularly influential?
Of course, I agree with David that OSI was very much in facilitating what we have accomplished. And there are many organizations. I would rather point to some individuals who are not present today, but were very influential as well. At least Jan Veltrup was very inspiring to me as being the first, representing the first publisher really going for gold away. And Ahmed Hindawi was a very powerful person as well, paving the way. And I find it very interesting in the early days to actually discuss with those pure open access publishers like PLOS as well. Mark was very predominant at that time, and that was very inspiring for me to try to envisage a new model for publishing, and those persons has been key persons in the development since then.
Thank you. Susan, how about you?
I'm going to indulge myself with a long list, I'm afraid.
Please, we have time. And I've got a long list as well, so hopefully you'll tick some off here for me.
Well, obviously Peter Zuber, as we all know.
And Peter, of course, kicked off with a keynote at our first conference as well. He too is unfortunately unable to travel these days, so
And Jean-Claude, I'm lucky to be sitting on the panel with some of the big gurus, and obviously Lars as well. Dominic Babini, for me, from Argentina and Latin America, Claxo, has been one of my gurus. Also, from the University of Cape Town, Eve Gray, a good friend and certainly very influential within the African continent and developing countries and as regards to open access, and more recently her colleagues Lorna Chernovitz and Michelle Wilmers. Subhaya Arunachalam from India, another big researcher and proponent of open access from a long time ago.
And still active.
And still active.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Joseph from SPARC, and on an organizational level, in terms of the architecture for openness in general, in publishing the Public Knowledge Project, and John Wolinski and his colleagues.
I know Kevin Stranick's here as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks for the coffee, Kevin.
We can maybe come back to talking a little bit about some of those organizations as well.
Sure.
Paul, how about for you? I mean, obviously Ahmed himself was mentioned, someone that you've worked with, so I'm sure obviously for your own career he's been very important, but other organizations that inspired you?
Yeah, so I don't think you helped by sending this question in advance, because it just caused me to think a lot about it. And so I tried to think, you know, there's lots of publishers that I think have been important in the process, but given where we are today, and particularly with the sort of developments of the past few weeks, funders have been at the top of my mind. And I think there's one person that's just very clearly been a guiding force, and that's Robert Kiley. I think without Robert really pushing Wellcome towards supporting open access, I'm not really sure where we'd be today. And I think he's really been important in helping lead such a large organization as a single person. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of support within the organization as well, but his personal impact has been tremendous. And again, I don't know where we'd be without Robert's work.
How about you?
Well, I would repeat some names because they're very, very important. And in particular, I would reiterate Melissa's work, which was really central. I worked with her when I was on the sub-board that she worked for, actually, inside OSI. And she was really, really at the center of many of these things. And as you said, or some of you said, very cautiously, very prudently, very silently, but she was there, and very, very importantly. Peter is another really important person. He wrote BOAI, essentially. I mean, we tweaked it, but he wrote BOAI. And the magnificent opening sentence is, I think, ringing in everybody's ears still. You know, it's
Are you able to quote it?
An old tradition and a new technology have conspired or have come together to et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, right. It's like 20 years ago, but 12 years ago, whatever. Those two absolutely central in my own mind. A person nobody has mentioned, a person who has been sometimes the center of many controversies, a person with whom I've battled over and over again. Yet I somehow like very, very much, even though he had nothing good to say about publishers.
I know where you're going with this.
Stéphane Harnad. Yeah. I saw him again last week. We go to chamber music together in Montreal. He lives about 300 yards away from me. So you see how bad the conspiracy can be.
Is he a good neighbor then?
He's a very good neighbor.
Okay.
You know, he jogs around, and he's a very fine neighbor. And he's played a very important role in shaping the world of open access. I'm glad we heard the names of Dominique Babini, who is having trouble with her daughter's health. She can't travel very easily nowadays. Dominique is a superb person. Eve Gray is another superb person, another great friend. I would say the whole Latino group is really interesting. Abel Packer, I would say Ana Maria Cheto in Latindex. I've got, of course, a senior moment, but the head of Redalic should be mentioned as well. These are extremely important people, and they've reminded us that science was really a worldwide enterprise with different, sometimes, objectives, different really visions of what science should be about, and that's very healthy for all of us. I'll stop there, but I could say Heather should be mentioned too, but then it's a question of conspiracy and you know, whatever you want to call it. We're such good old friends that it doesn't make sense to mention each other.
It's interesting that you mentioned Stephen Harnad, because I also started making a list, and I included him. And very often Stephen and I came at things from a very different angle. But what I really appreciated, and I kind of miss sparring with Stephen, because he's backed away a little bit, hasn't he? He was very principled, and he did stand up for you, even so that we had an instance where OWASPA was under criticism for something, and where I was out in the public space trying to defend things. And he actually stepped in and stood up for me and for OWASPA. And so although he was not interested in publishers per se, that didn't block his perspective. Similarly, someone who I also miss very much who stepped back is Alma Swan, who was she was so good about coming to the dialogue with evidence-based information to inform how she was moving things forward. And just to name a few other people as well that had a lot to do with OWASPA, but I think in general for open access, I do want to mention two of our co-founders of OWASPA who were scholar publishers, because really a lot of the open access initially started growing from the scholar publishers. And that was, in particular, David Solomon, who would have been lovely to have him here today. He's still doing research work, but he is no longer involved in publishing himself. And Günther Eisenbach, who has now gone on, in addition to his own journal and sort of building a bit of a larger organization around the one journal and bringing on other journals, has also launched something called TrendMD. So I think, because I think, Lars, you with the DOAJ, there's a lot of scholar publishers that are located there and that you have contact with. What would you say has been the importance of having the scholar publishers involved in this arena? I'm putting you on the spot here, but...
yeah, well,
I should say too, it's been a challenge for us in OWASPA, because these are folks who are trying to do their day job and being a professor or a researcher, an educator, and are publishing a journal alongside. So for them to be able to engage in these conversations has been difficult. So DOAJ, I think, has played an important role there.
I think it's important that we embrace the whole sector, not only in terms of different kinds of publishers, and of course scholarly publishers play an important role here, but as well the thousands of publishers that are located at universities, university departments, and it's crucial to look beyond the north and the west. And this has been a driving force for me to, in the work we are doing, to be global and to move OWASPA beyond being a sort of one-to-one competitor to the STM publishers, to be broader and to be more inclusive. That's very important, because I think it's important to realize that we should try to make a global scholarly communication system.
Susan, maybe you could pick up on that. Global scholarly communication system.
Thanks. I was about to ask if I may jump in.
Yes,
actually.
please.
One of my bugbears that I always bring up at these kinds of events is a terminological issue, which Jean-Claude actually first made me think about, is the standard usage of the term international journal versus local journal, and all of the assumptions and condescension that is implicit in the actual real use of those terms to mean international being a journal that is professionally published in the global north versus a journal that is a standalone journal published from a country in the global south. And I just want to really underscore that there is a massive difference in terms of the nature and the norms of publishing in the global south. In developing countries, the norm is for journals to be not professionally published, to be scholar publishers or standalone journals, supported increasingly by platforms such as Agile, African Journals Online, or in Latin America, CLO, Reader Legal Index, and so on. Latin America is way in advance of Africa. We regard them as our big sister and a really good exemplifier for us. But yeah, just to note that the issues that we're dealing with in developing countries particularly as regards open access, are somewhat different to that in the north. Just to add, the debate about, I just find it extremely odd, and I'm not a librarian and I'm not an academic, but I find it extremely odd that northern universities did not recognize and claim scholarly research communication, excuse my slurring, as an intrinsic and core part of the academic endeavor and own it from the get-go. And the fact that they didn't opened it to commercial publishers filling that gap, which is not to say I have anything against anybody who works for a commercial publisher in the north.
Thank you.
Because
Good.
by and large, they're mostly really lovely people. But at the same time,
But
at the
just
same
go
time,
ahead, Susan, lay it out there.
I'm not convinced that it is the best use of what is essentially public funding. In the Southern Hemisphere, we don't have that situation. Although there is pressure, self-imposed pressure by the universities' policies for promotion and so on, for academics publishing from developing countries to submit their work to the prestigious big-name overseas journals, which is kind of intellectual brain drain from the developing south to the north, which is an issue that we still need to face. So just to try and cram a whole bunch of information into a short response there.
You've given us lots of points that I think we're going to pick up on through the conversation. Let me, before we go to those, I just want to back up a little bit, and I wanted to shoot over to David, because you and I started to have a conversation before we came down here this afternoon, and we were talking a little bit about, is there, so if we go 10 years back, there was a sense among many of us that we were involved in a movement, some kind of social movement. Not everyone felt that way, but I think quite a few people felt that way. And you, of course, being in SPARC Europe, were very much involved in advocacy, which one would think then is, trying to work from the grassroots. I'm just curious, are we still involved in a movement today? Or have things become so institutionalized to some extent that we're, and I'm going to come to you as well, being a sociologist, because I know social movements must be of interest here. But I thought I'd start with David, who's, real advocate.
Well, it is very different. So I started with SPARC Europe in 2002, and I dug out one of my sort of standard advocacy presentations that I went to any library in Europe that I was invited to, and I would sometimes present to the 5 interested people who were in that institution. And I got very used to being not particularly popular, and that's something that I had to deal with. But
and why weren't you popular?
because no one was interested.
Nobody cared.
Nobody cared. No one knew about it. No one understood it. In people's busy lives, it made it wasn't a priority for them. If you said to them intellectually, do you want your research to be disseminated more widely? They'd say, well, of course we do. But there was no connection there with their current practice and how it worked. So in that 15 years, we've come a tremendous way. So in that presentation, I talk about this thing called the DOAJ, and there's almost 500 open access journals listed. There's this new thing called Public Library of Science, so they've launched 2 new journals. Biomed Central have published 2,500 papers. So the scale of thing, it was almost like a cottage industry 15 years ago. And it has changed dramatically. Part of the change, I think, is to do with funders. Funders have become interested. You mentioned Wellcome. I mean, the interest in that the Wellcome have had went right back to Mark Walpert, who was the chief executive, who really got this very quickly and moved it forward. Some might argue moved it in a certain direction, which was the direction of a very large Western, very well-funded biomedical funder, but really took that and empowered people like Robert to move forward. And now you see the discussions not being about what is open access, but how do we context open access in a broader way. So the discussions you certainly see in the UK now around this and within Europe more broadly is open access as a small part, as a facilitating part of open science. And that seems to be where the debate is, and that has transformed it completely. So it is no longer an aim in of itself, which I think for many of us it was 15 years ago. It is now a facilitator for new and exciting other things, and that has transformed the way that governments, funders, university vice chancellors and rectors think about some of these issues.
So has the movement then moved from open access to, is open science the movement now?
I think that increasingly for funders and for senior administrators, that's the way that they have become interested in open access.
And Jean-Claude, do you think that there's still, is there still a movement needed?
Oh,
Or you would argue that...
absolutely. I mean, the open access, first of all, is an epiphenomenon of digitization. We must never forget that. In passing, people refer all the time to 1665 as if somehow a gesture of creation happened that day. What we should ask is, what impelled people to invent journals in 1665 with the print technology? We're at the cusp of saying, do we still need journals? And with the new technologies, isn't something else coming along? And isn't that what we should be looking towards, and not being stuck in our rearview mirror, as McLuhan used to say? That's the first thing. The second thing that I should say is that, well, the debates around open access demonstrate one thing. What is open access? And the battle has been in defining open access, shaping it, making it evolve in a certain way or another. At first, publishers almost unanimously were totally opposed to open access. I mean, there was a very strong resistance around in the early 90s and middle 90s. This was not the case. This was not the problem. Well, the year when Paul Ginsparg sets up Archive, 1991, Elsevier is issuing Tulip. And what is Tulip really known for? It's when texts are no longer sold, they're licensed. We're going into an entirely different legal framework. And the whole thing was changed at that point between librarians and publishers. And you might say many of the discussions ever since came from that shift. What we really are having now is, I think, a definition of what open access is. For example, let me give you a very simple example. People say gold. And as soon as people say gold, they think APC gold. APC gold. Gold has never had anything to say about business models. Gold is simply journals being free, accessible, open, and so on, and reusable, presumably. But how you support it financially, that's a second-order problem. Now people say gold, APC gold. Now, a lot of people, myself included, say, let's not succumb about distortion of vocabulary. Let's work on the vocabulary itself and reinstate what gold has always been, green has always been, and so on. And actually, the movement is needed, to go back to your question, because those battles are going on. But the movement is also resting on different shoulders now. Yeah. And we've mentioned it, one which is, I think, really going to be the elephant in the room, or the gorilla, or whichever animal you want to use for this kind of thing. The whale, if you have the water. For the Norwegians in the room. Yeah, right. Yeah. You really have to think now that suddenly there's a group of people that said to themselves, oh yeah, by the way, we have the money. We are the ones with the money, the funders. We have the money. So maybe we have something to say about publishing and all of it going on. And if you put that in the context of also a period of history in which people are saying, by the way, what does publishing mean? What does is it necessary that behind a very complex series of steps called publishing, is it necessary to have just one unified institutionalized actor, like a publisher? You know, isn't there something else happening now? Exactly as in print. When the print book came out, something like an author began to appear. There was no authors before. No, don't forget that. There was no authors before print. And there were names circulating around text, but no authors. And then suddenly a series of functions were attached to that individual. You have publishing functions now appearing very clearly in our eyesight, and funders are saying, shouldn't we relook, take a second look, revisiting the way this thing is aggregated right now? And should it not be reorganized somehow differently? That's, I think, where the movement is going to be very useful.
That's interesting. And so there's 2 points, I think, Paul, if you could pick up on a couple things, because I think Jean-Claude mentioned, obviously, several threads here, but 2 that I think we've been debating a bit in the OWASPA board. you know, is there still a mission here to move towards full OA? And I think the other piece of it is, Guido mentioned the presentation I had on the different flavors of OA. And at the time that I gave that presentation, it was, we were big, we were small, we had different publishing models, but sort of some of the basic tenets of what OA publishing was, we thought we all agreed on. And it became later clear to us that actually, as more actors became involved in this space, that we weren't all talking about the same thing. And hence we had worked on this How Open Is It document together with SPARC Europe and PLOS to start thinking about what are the various elements that can be tweaked here. So I'm just curious, Paul, some of your thoughts about, is there a movement? Is there still a movement? You are a for-profit publisher, yet pure OA. So.
Yeah, so I think.
And you have Katrina working for you, so that also pulls in here, right?
No, I mean, I think I've spent some time thinking about, are we really as unique, this open access thing, as we think? Are there other similar changes and movements going on? And I think it's actually a pretty common phenomenon. So, you know, if you look at things like the organic food movement or veganism, I'm vegan and I eat a lot of organic food, so I watch these things a lot. And I think you see similar trends that when they're really early on, it feels like everyone who talks about them is looking for the same thing. They're really not. It's just that it's so different than the existing sort of power structures that it's easy to assume that everybody who's a vegan or into organic food has got the same things in mind. As these trends start kicking off, you start realizing that there are different threads within it. You know, I've noticed recently Burger King has got vegan burgers, and a lot of vegans would look at that and say, well, that's just ridiculous. They're just, you know, trying to capitalize on this. And what you realize is there is some amount of anti-corporatism within the movement. There's some amount of sort of health consciousness within the movement. There's some amount of animal rights within the movement. And I think that's the same thing we have with open access, that there were lots of different motivations. People that were frustrated with scholarly publishers, commercial or otherwise. There are people that are frustrated with the unit of the journal and everything that goes into that. There's people that were frustrated really just with the access issues. And really, I guess the question for OASPA, and we do struggle with this, is how far down the road can we get and still have enough that unifies this group for us to still have common objectives and things we work towards? Because at some point, if we are successful enough, we will just be the dominant model, and then it's not really clear where we go. And you know, I think Mark Patterson and I, was it a year ago or so, had a number of discussions, somewhat joking, somewhat serious, about should we use the 10th anniversary to disband OASPA and claim job done? And not necessarily because everything's open access, but because a lot of the early mission was about establishing this as a viable model, proving that this can work as a model of dissemination, and essentially, are we at a stage where we need to completely reform different organizations with different objectives? And you know, you're here, and we haven't announced anything, and we're not, so we came to the view that there is still enough holding us together. But I think that is a question. How long will that last where we can still have enough in common that we can consider ourselves part of the same community or movement?
Yeah, and of course, I think we saw that to a certain extent in the fact, you know, we had Peter Suber earlier on, who threw a very wide net. He pulled in everything, included everything. And we did get to a point where you started to have to, within that space, decide which piece of it am I aligned with, because we started to find more things that were in competition with one another or didn't quite fit together. Yeah.
But that.
Yeah. Jump in, please, everybody.
Yeah, I think that even at the beginning, there were a lot of the people involved, a lot of the different actors came at it for very, very different reasons. Exactly that. There were, I mean, SPARC and SPARC Europe were formed originally from the library community complaining about high subscription prices and wanted to do something about the costs. Mm-hmm. That's a job that's still ongoing. You know, there were people who wanted to widen dissemination. There were people
like Kindawi who felt squeezed out of the subscription market and didn't feel like it was a functioning market where new entrants could come in and compete.
There were people who wanted to smash the neoliberal construct and destroy large publishers. There were people who wanted to experiment with open peer review, and they got slapped down very firmly by people like Stephen Harness, who said, no, it's not about that, it's about open access. But, you know, so all of those things were coming, and perhaps the beauty of the Budapest Open Access Initiative was it was able to clarify what it was, and people could say, well, I'm interested in this bit of it, but I signed up to the initiative. But my bit is actually the peer review bit, or the smashing of the big publishers, or the reducing costs type thing. So it's always been a movement that's had tensions within it, because different people and different actors have come to it in a different way and wanting different results from it.
So that doesn't mean that we have to collapse now just because we've got dissenting opinion. Please,
and
jump
just
in.
very simple, I think that because of these debates, which are still raging on actually, you have to really identify what you really want to hang on to use your phrase, the principles, the very basic principles. We're talking in this case about production of knowledge, the best form of distributed intelligence human beings have ever created. How do we cling to reality? The scientific revolution is our best attempt so far to cling to reality somehow and do it collectively through a distributed system of knowledge production. And once you get these kinds of very strong fundamental objectives, you can start saying, well, then there are some functions, principles, and the rest of it that are really, really worthy of being protected and promoted. And at the same time, they give you the bearings to move forward. You can't predict the future, but you can hang on to your principles, and you can make sure that with that you can start parsing out what's good and not so good. You know?
And I think in that we've touched, so I've got a couple of the gorillas on my list here to discuss, because why not? And I think one of them has been touched on in this conversation. So we have had folks that have come at open access with an interest in seeing the demise of commercial publishers. And I think paywall, the movie is an example of, you know, an undertone there of that there is a profit. We don't feel that that's appropriate. It sounds like the argument is sort of embedded in there that we ought to take this back to the public sector somehow. It's public monies. I'm going to throw this to you, Paul. Should we feel ashamed as commercial publishers about making money? I'm just going to be really blunt there.
So if we
you go home at night and sweat.
No, I mean, I think if you work for a commercial organization and you're not making money, you're not going to be around for a while, right? Yeah. Now, there's still a question, is scholarly communication a sphere in which there should be commercial providers? And, you know, my personal view is that yes, similar to lots of other things that support scholarship and research, I do think there's a role for for-profit companies. But I think any time when there are questions about the value of a player in a given market, it underlies that the market is somehow broken. And, you know, I think nobody really talks about the commercial interests in the beaker world, or, you know, in
who's building the university buildings.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things, because basically the markets work pretty well there. There's reasonable competition. There aren't large monopolies that sort of distort the market. And so I think the fact that there is so much anti-commercial sentiment is a sign that something is wrong. But my view is that if we fix the issues in the market, we can go back to a world where commercial organizations, and I think largely this is happening at the moment, commercial organizations are providing innovation, value, services that are important to the scholarly community, but it needs to be done in a way that is always supporting the interests of the end consumers, the research community.
And you would argue that we're not doing that entirely today if we've got this kind of backlash going on.
So I would say that the publishing industry as a whole still is a long ways away from that. I think looking at even a commercial publisher, a commercial open access publisher like Hindawi, I would argue that we do provide a clear positive value given the incentive systems that are in place. If those incentive systems were to change, we may no longer be needed to do what we're doing, or we might do other things that are similar, bits of what we're doing. But I think this is one of the things that there's an increasing recognition about, is that what is keeping the current system in place is not that commercial organizations are forcing everybody to publish in their journals and buy their journals. Commercial organizations have no ability to do such things. But the systems within which research is done and evaluated and researchers operate encourages authors to publish in these journals, readers to give attention to these journals. And at the moment, I haven't seen very viable alternatives to that have gotten any traction within the research community.
Yeah.
And so, my personal view is that if people don't like the way the system is, commercial publishers are not the ones that are in a great position to fix that. And this is why I think it's really interesting seeing funders taking a stronger stand, because they really are in a position to start dictating how the research that they fund gets disseminated and evaluated.
So you've touched then on, I think we're sort of touching a bit upon the role of the impact factor, among other things, in that. Because I think that we often get accused of helping push that forward, but yet, we're just playing the game like everybody else. We have to listen to our authors. This is what they feel is important in order to move their careers forward. Susan, you were mentioning also the impact factor and, this being really difficult. So I'm kind of curious. So I want to relate this to another conversation that, Paul, you and I have had on many occasions, and particularly early on in OA, was, we looked at this with an OA market might be more competitive. Because ideally, authors would look and say, oh, here, I can compare this service just like you do with hotels on Trivago. Here's this room and that room. Here's the different prices. Here I get an ocean view. But gosh, people say that the service here is really excellent. Maybe I'll choose this. Yeah. So my question is, if we could just, with a magic wand, wave away the impact factor, would things be more competitive? And I'm going to bring in Susan after that to ask a little bit what that might mean for Africa.
So I think
hypothetically,
my
obviously.
view is that the impact factor is a manifestation of the prestige that's assigned to particular journals. If we didn't have the impact factor, I'm not sure that the world would magically be better. I think there might still be some sense of which journals are prestigious and the fact that publishing in those journals is very important. If anything, one thing I've really thought about is that the impact factor might actually be responsible for a lot of the growth of open access over the past 10 years. If you look at when things have taken off, when PLOS ONE got its impact factor, when, I think the whole rise of megajournals has largely been that these are able to give researchers what they need, which is an efficient publishing service, somewhere that has an impact factor. And if we didn't have the impact factor, it may be that the sort of old traditional journals would have an even stronger leg up, because something like PLOS ONE wouldn't have ever been able to establish itself as a credible venue. It's impossible to know, but I do think that the impact factor is just the most extreme visible element of this journal hierarchy that otherwise still would have existed, and if we get rid of the impact factor, probably will exist in some other form.
No, I disagree with you.
Now, I was going to, so Jean-Claude, you and I, the last time we saw each other was in Mexico City, and I think we were both touching on this notion between there being a difference between prestige and quality and ranking, and that any journal can be quality and have quality initially, but obviously prestige and ranking in these types of things.
Well, and within a journal, the variety, the diversity of quality can be extraordinary. I mean, you can have very bad articles and very good articles in any journal, actually. No, the whole thing is, I think, very well portrayed by a former employee of Elsevier who wrote a history of Elsevier, very bad book, by the way. And I'm going to give you the title because that's the only good thing in the book. It's John Regatzi's book, the content, From Content as King to Content as Kingmaker. Now, that's exactly what happened. When you say open access succeeded thanks to the impact factor, it would be like a vegan being judged for having succeeded in veganism by having built a big company making lots of money, so because you put him inside an economic system or a similar analogy to make your evaluation. Open access had to shape itself to the environment to start even emerging a little bit, and it's not a proof of success, it's a proof of adaptation. Now, to go back to journals, the whole issue of evaluation of research, first of all, is recent in science as associated to journals. That happened after 1950-55. That happened when precisely journals began to be commercial. Before that, the society's journals had reputations. And people could say, well, yeah, I mean, the Royal Society Journal journals are good journals because they come from this institution. But the French would have looked at the Academy of Science and the Russians to their St. Petersburg and so on. And they would have exchanged their journals among each other anyway. And people would say, well, if you publish in any one of these journals, you're doing fine. And these are the good ones, you know. They were not a ranking, especially with 3 decimals, invented by I don't know what lunatic. You know, can anyone in this room demonstrate to me why we should have 3 decimals with the impact factor?
You've described in your paper
That's absurd. That's absurd. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, Garfield himself has said it.
But it's precisely for that ranking, isn't it? 'Cause it's so that you can distinguish between two.
So we manage by ranking because we want to manage by competition, and then we call that, you know, the right competitive or a market environment, and everything is fine. Can you think a bit out of the box, please? Do you like your box that much?
Susan, you look like you had something to add there.
Yeah, I do.
I'm sure you do.
So I think one of the reasons why the impact factor has been so successful is because it's such an easy tool for university administrators and librarians to use as a proxy. It's handed over the power of assessing quality of research outputs to a little number that is generated by a for-profit company. Which is very unfortunate because it actually reinforces the status quo, and it reinforces the box, and it reinforces the power inequality between publishing in the north and publishing in the south. If it was to magically disappear, which I don't think it will, I think that might be kind of partially alleviated, but what will take its place? And the question at the moment is that what we keep the impact factor as one tool in an array of new ways to assess the quality of journals, be they kind of a new version of mega journals with you know, public post peer review or whatever the case, whatever future form scholarly communication might be shared. We will still need means to assist researchers and librarians and decision makers in universities in deciding amongst the huge volume of research output that there is. We will still need some proxies for assessing quality of, and to that end, just to blow my own organizational and partnership with INASP in the UK's horn, we've established a set of criteria based on all existing ones called the Journal Publishing Practices and Standards Framework, which is partly an educational tool for standalone non-professional journal publishers or to understand the norms of quality of publishing and the sort of basic stuff that you need to signal that you have sound publishing processes in place as one alternative or addition to that range of assessments.
Oh, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in and say that I think, in my view, the problem is whenever you try to reduce quality to metrics in any field, it falls short. And so I don't think replacing the impact factor with some other metric is the way you get there. And, you know, in discussions with sort of people about the topic, they'll often say, well, how would a university be able to evaluate the hundreds of applicants for a job? And I think, well, we do this, right? We're recruiting at the moment for lots of positions. There's not a single thing on an applicant's resume where we tally up a bunch of numbers and then say, oh, you've made it over the cut, we're going to give you an interview. We subjectively evaluate them based on what they present and then make a decision. And I think that's really the only way of getting away from this here. If we replace the impact factor with any other metric, even if it's a researcher-driven metric like the H-index or anything else, we're going to be right back in the same spot. And you know, I think it's, you see it in every field. Yelp reviews, TripAdvisor scores, and all of this, they really fall short. And I think that's why there is still a role for, you know, the critic, the restaurant critic that goes in and has a subjective evaluation of a particular experience, because you can't reduce quality and experience, particularly for something as diverse as all scientific research, down to a single number. It's crazy.
So I think we'll move from the impact factor, but I wanted to just say, we're going to take some questions as well from the audience, so you can start thinking if you have any. But also, if you'd like to already now use hashtag COASP10, send through your questions. I'll be monitoring here, and we can pick some up as well. But I did want to get to at least one more of the elephants in the room, or the gorillas, as it were. And I'm going to shoot down to David there, but I'll be looking for Lars to come in here as well. I think one of the real controversial issues today, and also within OWASPA, is offsetting and hybrid. And David, I think for many, you as well as, let's say, nucleic acids research at Oxford are seen as sort of the father of hybrid. I didn't say grandfather. You have to be around for much longer. But you certainly, in terms of sort of setting the tone for hybrid and offsetting being a possible way forward. And I'm just curious, if you were knowing what you know today, what might you have told yourself then, writing the paper that you did? And I know you brought that with you, as it turned out.
I dug it out. So this was the 2003 paper, From Here to There, a proposed mechanism for transforming journals from closed to open access. There's a picture of me without beard. I'm looking very young and naive. I'm now looking old and naive.
Hardly.
So interestingly, sort of back then, a lot of the same issues were prevalent, and there was a concern, especially with the society publishers, about this newfangled thing, open access. They had successful publishing businesses. How were they going to, which were supporting their other activities? And that's a different debate. How were they going to transition to open access? How could they do that? And this struck me as a very low-risk, simple way to make a transition. If you were sincerely wanting to move to open access, this is one that you could do it at a pace at which the community was moving, at a pace at which the funders were moving, and you could do that in an orderly manner and still maintain your business. I picked it up from, there was a couple of journals in Florida that were working on something like this, run by a guy called Tom Walker. And so for a little while, Peter Suber tried to get this called the Walker-Prosser model. And at the time, I was very, I've got something named after me. This is fantastic. As you can imagine, as the years have gone by, I have become more and more grateful that name did not stick, and it became known as the hybrid model. So for me...
But so many publishers would really love you right now. Yeah.
Well, I should be getting a cut. I'm not saying anything. If anyone wants to buy me a drink later. I think for me, the place where it fell down was that my belief that there would be a sincerity in the transition. And I've seen it increasingly being used in what I would describe as a very insincere way, as look, the UK have said they want to spend more money on gold open access. Let's make our journals hybrid. We can pull in this money. We can make an extra, £1 million off a large, university in London from their APC payments. And we're not really going to make any significant transition. We're actually going to do it quite badly, so we won't put the right license on it, and we'll keep it closed access for a few weeks until they notice it's not open access, and then do it. There have been some publishers whose systems, and system change takes a long time, but whose systems have, and this generates a lot of frustration with certain publishers that we were talking about earlier. They have not been able to actually deliver the product that they were saying that they were taking thousands of euros for, and that's caused a lot of frustration. And then on the offsetting side, again, there have been some publishers, many of them whom are in this room, who have engaged, who have looked at how certain territories, and again the UK was one of them, have really embraced the gold APC model and have moved to fund that. But it means that we're spending a lot more money there, because we're paying the full subscriptions, and the subscriptions aren't going down for us, and we're then paying a lot of money on APCs on top. And the reaction from some publishers, and I say some publishers, and I actually really mean Elsevier mainly, has been to try and deny that there's such a thing as double dipping. If there is such a thing as double dipping, we're definitely not doing it, even though we've all previously said that we don't really understand what it means. So that's where the frustrations become, this feeling that some publishers are not seeing it, using it as a sincere transition mechanism. They're just using it as a way of generating, basically for hybrid, it seems to me that if you charge an APC to make a paper open access, that is pretty much pure profit. There doesn't seem to be much effort and much cost involved there. And that's pure profit, and they're just raking in the money. And I think that insincerity with some publishers is led to the issues like Plan S talking about getting rid of hybrid.
I was just going to say, because obviously we could bring in Plan S there, having stated that we're looking,
and so
they're looking to move away from
my
hybrid.
fear is that we throw out the sincere publishers because we don't have any nuance. And actually, Chris Banks raised this issue from Imperial at a meeting earlier this year about how there's a danger that we lose nuance with this, and we just say the nuclear option.
Because of course, Guido also mentioned that for some authors, this is the first time they've engaged with gold.
Yeah.
And that may also bring them back again to also
APC
go to pure
gold.
APC gold. And I think that's a really, yes, thank you. I thought that was actually a very good point that you make. I should also just say, I know that we are one-sided on this panel because we don't have a mixed model publisher other than myself, but I'm not going to engage in that directly other than asking the questions. But that also was because this was the early movers panel, and we weren't really many early movers there that were subscription publishers. Though we could mention Sage was working with Hindawi at that time and so was involved. But
Well,
I know Lars wanted to jump in, so let me just get Lars and I'll come back to you, Paul, because I think you've also got some input here.
Yeah, I think the issue of hybrid publishing is very important as well.
Be sure to get in the microphone too.
But I think I'll address it from a slightly different angle. And I will include green open access in this because what we have seen and what we have done is with green open access, we have created an additional workflow, right? And hybrid publishing suddenly became much more popular when we could see funders' mandates coming on, and it was suddenly very important for the legacy publishers to have as many open access outlets as possible. And underlying that, underlying these developments is the notion, the sacred cow of academic freedom. Some of you will recall that Stephen Curry at this conference 2 years ago talked about academic freedom and about academic responsibility. So both green open access and hybrid is to a large extent brought in place to accommodate the wish for researchers to publish where they always have been publishing. I think it's very important, as Paul just said, the publishers cannot change this system. It is the funders. And what we have seen in the last decade or so is that funders are flirting with a little bit trying to reclaim scholarly publishing by issuing mandates, and we have seen Plan S recently where they are going a couple of steps further. And I think that is very important because at the point when research funders can sort of imply that what we are asking you as a researcher is to have responsible research behavior, namely open access from day one, data open, and your software open. And that will put hybrid open access and green open access on the spot.
I'm going to turn to Paul. I want to come back to the green and gold, though, or green and gold and hybrid in relationship to humanities, social science in just a moment as well. But I want to bring you in, Paul.
So I just wanted to quickly say that I'm not a huge fan of hybrid open access, probably for different reasons than many others. I think the way it's been implemented has largely distorted the business model that would make open access publishing more efficient, more transparent, more competitive, more inclusive. But I think it's important to note when I really get bothered when people say that publishers weren't sincere in using hybrid as a transition to full OA. Because I think a lot of it has come down to the inconsistent support for open access publishing from funders in different parts of the world. And I think it's amazing that the funders in Europe have taken such a strong position in supporting open access publishing. But the fact is, in the United States and a lot of other places, there has been much less support for open access models. And I think that is part of the reason why a traditionally subscription journal is not in a position to transition to a fully open access model through hybrid, because it is only a small fraction of the authorship that is got the resources to be publishing hybrid articles. Now, again, I don't really like hybrid. I think it's got all sorts of issues with it, but I think it is important to note that the difference in how funders have treated the open access argument, and I'm sure the same is going to reemerge with other open science issues, open data mandates and all sorts of other things. That's what will drive change. And you know, when asked who I think the most influential person's been, I said Robert Kiley, because I do think that Wellcome taking a strong stance has been a big part of why open access has taken off across Europe. And it would be great to see the American funders and funders from around the rest of the world engaged more closely at the level that the European funders are.
Please jump in, Susan.
I would like to make a very minor point about terminology, and it was one of Peter Suber's criticisms about Plan S, which is the use of open science as opposed to open scholarship. Because you wanted to bring in humanities and social sciences, I just thought it was worthwhile bringing it up as a correction at this relatively early stage, away from open science and towards open scholarship to be more inclusive.
Yeah, and so one of the other things I think with Plan S is and this we'll hear more about tomorrow, obviously, but that thinking around an APC model, as you're saying, and I don't think we have any strong humanities social science represented on this panel right now, but I'm wondering, how do we bring in social sciences, humanities into some of the models that are being put forward? I think some saw offsetting hybrid as one possible way to do that. Obviously, there are other models. We know that there's some other organizations that have been testing other models that in some ways are similar to deals from the past, though with many important differences. Do you have any thoughts on being a social scientist yourself?
Well, if I may make a joking remark, first of all, if David is really the father of the hybrid solution, with due respect to him, I do think this was a clear case of premature ejaculation.
Can we edit that in the filming?
We're close to Freud's SPARC. I mean, so I don't think we should worry about that too much. I think we're all mature people. We all know what it is. Well, joking aside, your question is going to allow me to move one step back. Why humanities and social sciences? Why do they present a problem? Well, for one thing, their journals until recently never became commercial. You know, they remained very close to the site of production, a lot of university-based and so on. It's only quite recently that the encroachment into this kind of ecosystem has become more visible. The second thing, too, is that in the humanities and many of the social sciences, the currency of value is not the journal, it's the book. And that allows me to go back to an earlier remark I made. I think one thing we're missing all in this is that the unit journal or the unit book, however variable and different they may look, which proves my point, by the way, those things are going to move away. They're going to move away. We're going to be on platforms with documents ranging from small articles or even nano publications, adding to other publications, to very, very long and important and syntheses and so on. But there's going to be a continuum. So the distinction is going to eventually fade away. That's, I think, the first thing we have to talk about. And that goes back to the issue of evaluation again. If we keep on trying to evaluate the content of journals because they are inside journals as a way to evaluate research, we're going to run into a wall. It's not going to work. It's not working already. It's creating the problem. So what I see is that there is a short-term problem for humanities and social sciences to sort of adapt to this digital world, but they may end up being in a better position to move really into the digital world than the rest of science, medicine, and so on, because they don't have such a legacy and such an investment in the traditional modes of dissemination of knowledge. They may simply decide that they can innovate completely. Also in passing, by the way, when we're talking about innovation, remember that in the 90s and even late 80s, Who was innovating in this whole area? Not publishers. Faculty members, researchers. Jim O'Donnell, Harnad again, yours truly in 91 with Surface. We were inventing journals at that time. They were not coming from publishers. We were doing it ourselves. So what I see with this transition in the digital world, which is slowly unraveling, slowly moving forward, we see the objects changing, we see the actors changing their role and the relative importance of these actors. Now, in terms of the whole present system that we have as an inheritance from print, do not forget that the present system did not begin really to emerge with the present economic conditions of market competitivity and all that much before 1955. It's Robert Maxwell and his way of finally finding a way to make commercial journals not only profitable, but highly profitable. Before that, you had some commercial journals in the whole ecosystem in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but they were not the center or the defining objects of the ecosystem of publishing. It's only after 55 that this started. This is yesterday. Yeah. And in history, I'm a historian more than a sociologist. In history, 50 years is a joke, you know.
So yeah,
Can
please, yeah.
Well, first of all, after Jean-Claude's comment, I'm now wishing this was vodka rather than but
then you'd have more problems. Sorry,
I
couldn't help it. Please, let's get back to the series.
Male physiology is becoming rather interesting this afternoon.
You know, I'm enjoying being the centre of attention. But, maybe I'll give my name to a different condition rather than to the hydrogen. So, I mean, I was thinking of before this started about a couple of disappointments I have, but maybe there's a new one now. But one of them was about innovation in types of formats and papers. And Jean-Claude, you were very confident in saying we're going to change, and we haven't. I mean, if you look at what we're publishing now in terms of journals, what we're publishing in terms of books, they're the same thing as we were publishing. You know, there's a few experiments here or there, but they're right at the edges, and we're not actually changing much in what we're doing. We still do. You know, a scientific paper is a scientific paper, and as it has been.
And Susan, you maybe have a little bit of a similar situation with Africa that has less of a legacy, or maybe another point you wanted to make.
Well, I can join the two. In developing countries, we kind of largely copied and pasted the format of publishing from the north, which has been particularly unfortunate because we had the opportunity not to do so and to start differently. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What were you just talking about?
Different formats and the way whether they're changing.
Yes. When I started in this field of publishing and supporting the access to African published peer-reviewed research outputs, it was a very rapid learning curve for me. And 2009 OASPA conference and 2010 OASPA conference, I attended specifically to learn about what was this thing called open access. And one of the things that struck me at the time, and has struck me ever since, is that the proponents of open access seem to think that it would be a very, very quick transition because it makes so much sense. It is so logical. It seems so fair. It's got so much development kudos and respectability, and that the transition would be quick and it'd take a matter of years. But as Jean-Claude was just saying, the commercialization of journals was from 1955, and that was yesterday. The beginning of the open access movement and the formalization of that was 2003, which was an eye blink ago, actually, in the terms of scholarly communication and sharing, research as a part of the human endeavor. So I do think maybe that the time frames that were expected were a little naive, and that the change will still come.
So I want to bring in a question from the audience that I think fits with this notion of, well, we have different formats, and it was preprints. Is this sort of one possibility that we're moving in that direction in terms of some new format? But I'm also curious in relationship to that. We're talking about preprints. Do you think, are we going to see humanities, social science, if we also bring in that, again, that topic, doing the same types of innovation as science? I mean, for me, the type of workflow is quite different if you are a musician scholar, for instance, than a lab scientist, and maybe there'd be other types of innovation taking place. So we can think about the preprint, and if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing up the issue of preprints, because it's exactly the sort of object which shows that the publishing process can be disaggregated and taken in various parts. So what we're saying there is that are we going to give some value socially, institutionally, and so on to an object which so far, until now, was essentially devalued, was taken as a, well, it's not kosher yet. You have to validate it. The point is that I'm going to go back to the metaphor I prefer about scientific knowledge and scholarly knowledge more generally, with differences, but still knowledge. It is that it is a great conversation. It's a flow. And we are so in the print world that we're completely, for example, locked in with notions such as a version of record. You've heard this sort of expression. One of the members of the expert group that I'm chairing right now at the European Commission came out with a beautiful answer to that. She said, actually, it's not a version of record we need, it's a record of versions. The conversation is generating new versions. Look at Vitek Trak's process in research F1000 research. You don't have a paper anymore, David. What you have is you submit something, people start commenting on it, to the point that, to the extent that with the comments, or the value of their comments, they get published as well. Then if you decide as a team, including perhaps with some of your commentators, to bring up a better synthesis, you start doing that with this version 2, and then you keep on going, and going, and going. And that's what knowledge is all about. These snapshots and freezing stuff through the print process, which now we painfully try to inflict like a Procrustean bed in the digital world, is going away. It's going away. Robert Kiley, who I think people are mentioning with, I think, perfect, valid admiration, is exploring the same thing at the Wellcome now with Wellcome Research. And I think the people at Gates are going to be doing the same thing. So, and in passing, I see Stuart here, the societies here have their entry into this. That's the alliance between funders and researchers and these societies to maintain, to make the great conversation at last become what, with the word I detest normally, make research really sustainable. Incidentally, my seat is not very sustainable.
No, I know. They're a bit wobbly here. Layla is here with a microphone, and I want, because I know not everyone has their computer open, I want to ask if there are any questions from the floor. I know we've been talking for quite some time. Stuart here at the front has got a question. And we may have to move some mics into the middle or have you just shout out your question, and then I'll repeat it.
Hi, Stuart Taylor from the Royal Society. It's actually not a question, it's just a couple of comments.
Oh, good.
One thing that Jean-Claude mentioned about the fact that gold doesn't mean APC gold, they're two different things. Lars recently helped me look at this with the DOAJ, and we found that actually 75% of gold journals do not have an APC, so I just think people need to remember that. The other comment is something that Paul said about whether publishers should have a place in this, commercial organizations should have a place in this. Commercial organizations will always look to make money out of the situation. That's entirely understandable and quite legitimate. It's the researchers who don't seem to know what they want, and they need to decide what it is that they want. Publishers can then probably be guaranteed to provide that for them in some way. And you know, when you look at the progress of open access and its slowness, it's that publishers are actually far more interested in open access than the academics seem to be. You know, they don't seem to be sufficiently bothered about it to really move things along. And so if you have a hybrid journal, which you could argue is a slow transition, but why is it a slow transition? Because not enough people are taking the gold option in it. So, you know, it seems a bit odd for me to be sitting here defending commercial publishers, I admit, but, you know, they are doing what they're doing, and you can't really expect them to behave any differently until the academy says it wants something different.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a similar example to the uptake of open access has been the whole impact factor question. A whole bunch of publishers have come to the clear recognition that this is just bad for scholarly communication. Take impact factors down off our website. What are the most searched terms? What are the most common queries we get from authors? What's the impact factor of the journal? And it's incredibly frustrating sometimes to feel like even when you try to do the right thing, the end users who should be benefiting from this are so stuck in another system. And part of it is that this is not their day job. This is not what they do. They have research activities. But I completely agree that I think if the research community changes their priorities, and I think funders are probably a better proxy than the individual researchers out in the world, publishers are going to change overnight, and or at least the good ones will, and they'll stick around. And so I think that's where I've been encouraged, is really seeing funding organizations really start asserting more power in the conversation.
Well, Jean-Claude and then Susan.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at the researcher. We often speak about the researcher community. A researcher is a funny individual. He seeks information in one way. He seeks status and recognition and career advancement another way. And then there is a third subset of this whole group, which plays a very peculiar role, which is very poorly studied by the sociologists, by the way. It's the editors, the academics who are editors of journals. And they are playing that role in between the journal and the research community. Now, the researchers are really powerless, especially young ones, untenured and so on. I mean, when you are a young prof, just coming out of your postdoc, and you begin your career, you don't go around saying, I want to blow up the university. You know, you don't. You may say it after a couple of beers, but you won't say it too loud. And the reason is that they've got to make it through, that sort of thing. They are put in a very strict game where these kinds of rules, impact factor way as a proxy, impact factor as a proxy to evaluate quality or whatever. Why is that happening? Because the universities themselves are caught in a game. And that game is the financing game of the university in most countries, which starts relying on procedures which rest on what again? The impact factor. You know, you have the Shanghai and whatever, and the the Times Education and so on. They all play with this impact factor somewhere in the game. So that the whole system has been rigged from top to bottom as if we run our health system by looking at rules that apply to league football players, you know, and getting to the whole society. Imagine if we run our health system that way. The NHS in Britain is not doing too well, but that would be really terrible then. You know, it would really, it would be a problem. So, you know, as long as we're caught in this competitive management, I mean, science is not just pure competition. Science is also collaboration and sharing, where people are constantly trying to vie for positions, and the journals remain this sort of leverage system with which you can run the whole system. You're not going to get out of it. And that's why what I really, and that's why I'm so optimistic about the future, I really see that with the digitization, the journal can't stand. It cannot stay. It's too rigid, too poorly done, too poorly conceived. And the result is going to be a really interesting moment when a lot of new affordances and opportunities, I think, can begin to appear.
Thanks. I was going to make a very similar point, far less eloquently than Jean-Claude, which is that as commercial publishers are playing a game and making the most of the incentives and opportunities that there are, so are researchers playing a game according to a particular set of rules. And those rules are often based on the impact factor, which is naively in developing countries certainly and probably elsewhere considered to be a fair, equitable and inclusive measure of things, whereas it's actually extremely limited in terms of the numbers of journals it will include, and it is biased against particular topics in particular regions. So the rules need to be changed. And the part, we mentioned funders quite often in terms of changing policies and incentives, but also government policies also are needed to help change the rules within the game players for researchers within universities. And librarians actually helping faculty in terms of changing the way that they pass on the knowledge of how to play the game to the next generation of researchers as well.
it's interesting to me how all roads lead back to the impact factor somehow. We always end up landing on the impact factor in these discussions. I want to just ask one last time if there are any final questions. Oh, goodness, there is. We're going to grab at this one in the middle. We've got a few more minutes before the coffee break. We've got 45 minutes during the coffee break, which is going to give us lots of time to chat with one another about these topics and others. Go ahead.
You've said repeatedly that publishers can't change the system, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But I think it goes beyond the system. It's also about the culture of interacting. And researchers, and I'm a librarian, we as librarians often feel at the mercy. And we have business partners where we have a feeling that there is a good culture in communicating, but there are also publishers where you clearly feel that they know that you are at their mercy. And when you have a database provider who simply comes and says, okay, and now it's 400% price increase for the next year, and yes, you might scream and yell, etc., it doesn't matter because we know you need it, so swallow it, then there is a problem in the culture and not only in the system. The same, and this also touches upon open access, when we do open access agreements, I think in a culture where we negotiate with publishers and it's clear what our intent is, so that researchers can publish their articles open access. And next thing we realize that if you look at the fine print, there is yet again a loophole distinguishing between publication and early access to articles, and oh no, we only pay for published articles, but that which is early access is still to be paid, then suddenly you're in a position where you say, why, what kind of partnership is that? Also business relationship where we negotiate, we make our intent clear, we pay for it, and in Austria it is taxpayers' money. And next thing we realize is, okay, because it is still counted in print publication, there are 3 months where actually the articles have to be paid for, which is clearly against the intent of the entire agreement. That's also not good for the culture.
Okay. David, have you got a comment to that?
Yeah, I think one of the really intriguing things over the past 20 years have been the different players in the system, their individual power and their perceived power. So for a long time, and I remember having conversations with funders about this, or like 10 years ago, the funders would say things like, well, we can't move too quickly, there's competition amongst the researchers for our money. And you think, no, wait a minute, if you're giving them €1 million to run a project, you probably have some power, you can probably put some conditions on. And slowly that's changed. I think that you're right, I think that for a long time, the library community has probably felt one of the most powerless parts or underpowered parts of this system. I think in the last year or two, and partly we've seen things that have been happening in Germany and their relationships with big deals, I think there's been a feeling within the library community that we can actually be a little bit braver, that if we cancel big deals, then the sky's not going to fall on our heads. We're going to be able to find other ways of fulfilling the needs of our researchers. And I think that that's also tying in with the open access side of things as well. So if you want something to look out for, it's look out for slightly braver, slightly louder librarians. We'll still be very polite, but we might be braver and louder.
Thanks, David. Was there anything you wanted to add? Yeah.
Very quickly, I think what David said is perfectly right, by the way, and I fully agree with that. When a funder gives grants, big grants, with a failure rate of maybe 88%, you can probably say to yourself as a funder, those people, when they're going to publish, are probably going to be decent publishing. At least we can give them a chance to do that. And therefore, a so-called preprint thing could be very quickly taken over by the funders, as a matter of course for their own grantees, because they are presumably pretty good people. If you want to make it more objective and more trustworthy, you create a network of funders so that you can monitor each other, and that would create more objectivity in the process. With the libraries, because I think that's a very important question, I really wish you would speak to the head librarian in my university, at the University of Montréal, Richard Dumont, who is who is a very fine man indeed, he's done a very good series of studies on the cost per use, not the cost per downloads or the cost per use. He's also made a study of what happens when you unravel a big deal and what it does to the research community's efficiency if you supply what has been calculated to be 70 or 80% of what the alleged needs of the community are, and you find out that there is no difference at all, you know. So he's unraveling big deal after big deal with a number of publishers simply by aligning himself with students and faculty. That's the important part, creating a united front and going towards the publishers with this kind of message. At that point, you know, the university becomes pretty formidable. If the administration, the faculty, the students, and the librarians are working all together to the same goal, with the same objectives, it's pretty hard to move them aside.
And I'm feeling the absence of having a mixed model publisher on the panel right now to also comment on those things. I apologize that we've got to take the break now. I know that there's some other questions I hope that you'll ask. I wanted to just end, though, on a positive note. Some of that is probably positive for librarians, that there are opportunities there. But I think what I heard from all of you at some point is that there is hope, that we you know, we've always had, and we've always come at open access from different angles. And nonetheless, we've seen progress, we've seen things moving forward. Things have gone slower, but yet it is just a blink of an eye, 2013 and 2008. So on that, I'd like to invite everyone to come back upstairs to the top floor where we had the lunch. The coffee will be served, and we will be starting sharply at 4:15 here in this room again. And now you know, too, that there's limited seating, so get back early. Thank you very much, and thank you to my panelists.